Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello, there we go. How's everyone doing? Good. My name's Alex Schneps. I am Events and Programming Manager for WBUR CitySpace. Thank you so much for coming out today in the afternoon on a Monday. Thank you very much for being here. We've got a really great program, so I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I just wanted to say that if you like what you see here today, as I'm sure you may already know, but you can check out our entire lineup of events at wbur.org/cityspace. We've got events going on all through the week, most weeks throughout the year. So please do come back, and we'll see you here again soon, I hope. But I'd like to introduce our first two guests for today's program. So, Louise Aronson is a leading geriatrician, writer, educator, professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Elderhood, Redefining Aging, Transforming Medicine and Reimagining Life. She is a graduate of Harvard Medical School and the Warren Wilson Program for Writers. Dr. Aronson has received the Gold Professorship in Humanism in Medicine, the California Home Care Physician of the Year Award, and the American Geriatric Society Clinician Teacher of the Year Award. And her work has been featured on Today, CBS This Morning, NPR's Fresh Air, Politico, to name a number of other outlets. And in conversation with her will be Tom Model. Tom is founder and president of CNAP Alliance, Community Networks for Aging in Place Alliance, a nonprofit organization. Through CNAP Alliance, Tom works on bringing events like today's program, part of the Future of Aging program series, to individuals and organizations to help promote understanding of and collective action on issues critical to our aging society. And his purpose is to educate, inform, and promote collaborative efforts that help individuals learn about issues and opportunities related to aging and stimulate solutions to broader longevity society issues. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Tom and Louise and bring them up to the stage.
Well, Louise, let me welcome you to Boston.
Thank you. It's nice to be
And
here.
welcome to CitySpace. And I had to get an update because I've been involved with WBUR since about 2000. And when I was around when CitySpace was coming into being, I knew it as being projected as the hub of conversation for Greater Boston. But I've learned from Alex that CitySpace is now known by what's happening is here. And that's true. They celebrated their one-year anniversary on Friday, and it was enormously successful and so forth.
Great.
So your book, Elderhood, Redefining Aging, Transforming Medicine and Reimagining Life, gives us a collection of essay-like stories and real stories about how people age and how they're treated in society and so forth. Tell us how you came to write the book.
Well, first, I spent a lot of years not writing it, which apparently is part of the process, but painful. I was doing what I like to refer to as my real job. And then I had an idea for it, and I wrote about 3/4 of a draft that was like other doctor books, so I analyzed them in typical neurotic way. And generally, there were 8 to 12 chapters of about 25 to 30 pages each. And so I did that, and about 3/4 of the way through, I thought, I'm bored, and if I'm bored, that's not good for the reader. And then I just decided to get weird. I do think that's one of the best things about aging is that you feel more comfortable just being and doing yourself. And so I decided to do that. And I realized, too, that the structure could help me accomplish the goal. What I wanted to do was take true stories, but also pull from literature and history and science and medicine and show how the way we approach age in each of those areas is intrinsically interrelated to how we approach it in the other areas, that you can't look at any part of that in isolation. Yes, medicine is a mirror for the larger society, but it seemed helpful by doing sort of essayistic and real people plus more, concepts, and really having the weave speak to what it means to be human and an elder human in particular.
I love your stories and your essays. Being an engineer, the facts are always interesting, but the stories are very moving and talk about how people, your essays talk about how people are affected by language, and your choice of elderhood is something that I find particularly interesting, as we talked about. And your stories speak to the facts and feelings and important issues to people as they age in this period that you use the word elderhood for. I learned that the hood is a suffix, like knighthood, adulthood, childhood. Tell us, it's been used a little bit in the past, but I think you're the primary focus on it now.
Right, so I didn't make up the word elderhood. I actually tried to find out who did, and I couldn't. My original goal was actually to use the word oldhood, which always gets laughs, yes, unless it's a young audience and they think it's everything the same, basically. But so I did that in the New York Times, convinced that that's what I was going to do, and I was going to do it, I think, for the same reason that it gets laughs, which is that most people don't want to be associated with it. So I wanted to reform the word. Sort of like Black is beautiful, we're here, we're queer. There are any number of social movements that have really said what we are intrinsically is not a bad thing. So we're going to change this language and conversation. But then a reader, after the New York Times thing came out, a reader whom I don't know in New Jersey, nice woman, sends me a note, and she said, "You have a grammatical problem." And she was actually just right? Because if you have childhood, the person is a child. And if you have adulthood, the person is an adult. And if you have oldhood, what's an old, right? So then it became elderhood, which actually made my publisher hugely happy also.
Well, I like the word elder. It's not very popular in the Western cultures, but in Eastern cultures, there's a lot of reverence and respect for the word elder, which as an elder, I like to think about that would be nice to have. So words play a critical role in how we think and feel about ourselves and how we experience our life. But midway through your book, you touch on language, but throughout your book, you really stress the importance of how words and language impact and describe aging and getting old in general. So just for a moment, let's talk about words, and you've already started on that. You want to digress a little bit more on that?
Sure, happy to. It's really interesting, but every few years there are nationwide studies of the words we use for old age, everything from senior, old, elderly, geriatric, etc. And they survey people about which ones they prefer. So any guesses here, which one's preferred? Older adults, okay. Someone in the know. So really, they don't like any of those words I used. And the one that often gets used is older adults. And actually, in the medical literature, that's the only term you're allowed to use. It's actually mandated. I think it's inherently ageist. Here's why. I'm hoping to change this back. Older is a relative term. A 7-year-old is older than a 5-year-old. A 70-year-old is older than a 60-year-old. It's relative. At some point, and you may not like this, but it's better than being dead, we become old, right? And really my mission is to make that be okay. Because it needs to be okay. We're all becoming older. And until that becomes okay, until we recognize that life has 3 major phases, 3 major acts, like any good play, childhood, adulthood, and elderhood, then it's not okay to grow old. And that's not a good society to live in. You don't want to be apologizing for who you are. Actually, in health terms, as a clinician, I can say that's really bad for your health, and we might want to discuss that more. But and also a population without terminology. So in hospitals, we make adult hospitals and children's hospitals. What do we make for elders? Nursing homes? Not so nice, right? So until you have language, until every time somebody invokes childhood and adulthood, you say, and you need to be talking about elderhood, we have a problem. And until we who are growing older or already old feel comfortable with that terminology and can say it unapologetically, it still becomes something that is negative. If you lower your voice, if you deny it, it means it's bad. And if it's bad, then we're all growing and maturing towards becoming bad. And I refuse to accept that.
Me too. As you touch on in the book and have section devoted in the book, there's this thing called othering, which is very much tied to the use of words and language. And you talk about how the way in which you're described causes you to think about yourself in certain ways. Well, that's kind of benign compared to where othering can actually lead when you talk about racial discrimination and a lot of other things. So I think in terms of the words that are being used, and I'm pleased that you're willing to talk about that here, because I feel for this Future on Aging series that we have, words and language is something I want to keep on the table in the context of a variety of the topics that we'll address. So in terms of othering, you've already spoken to that a bit. Do you have anything particularly in addition to that you want to make a remark on? Or is it how does it create an atmosphere within the medical community? Because as Gawande referred to, one of the problems is the medicalization of old age.
Right.
And you speak to that yourself.
Yeah, and it was actually the sociologist Carol Estes who started talking about the medicalization in the 1970s, and who's done amazing work in aging over the decades. But those are sort of two different things. So I'll go back to othering, and then we can come back to medicalization maybe. But othering is something we do to people who are unlike ourselves. And aging has a little bit of a problem in that we all are born young. So we all start out not old. So old, as we become ourselves, old is other. And I think we've gotten into problems in that because old is sort of disrespected and devalued, we continue to push it. There's that joke book from, I think, a couple decades ago, which is titled, "Old Age is Always 10 Years Older Than I Am." And I see that. It's interesting. And I do think it's counterproductive. One of the reasons I wanted to go with a hood, with an elderhood, is to show that old age has as much length and variety as childhood and adulthood. I mean, think of childhood, a neonate versus a teen or young adult. Those are like almost different species of human animals. And one can argue that that's not so different from a 65-year-old versus my oldest patient was 111. Those are quite different people. And we need to understand that elderhood encompasses all of that. Just as, we have a young adult in our household now, and he's completely different from we are, and not just physically. So it's okay to grow and change. How boring would life be if we didn't?
Well, somebody pointed out to me, because I saw the reference to the fact that there are 4 generations in the elderhood in bracket. And being, again, an engineer, I thought, wait a minute, 30 years per generation, that doesn't work. What they're talking about is the great generation, the silent generation, the baby boomers, and
we're only at boomers now, yeah.
Pardon?
The boomers, not all boomers have reached elderhood yet.
No, that's true. So 3 generations maybe.
3.
So I read the wrong number.
Unless there are some at the very extreme on the other end, yes.
In terms of how language affects people, it's not just that it affects them in the way that they're treated, but in the way they think about themselves. And going back to the othering statement, when I first started thinking about that, I've never been particularly affected by thinking about or worrying about being old. But I began to realize when I thought about the term othering that there's so much of the language and the words coming at you that I suddenly realized that I'm becoming susceptible a little bit to othering myself, which is really where you get in trouble. Because then it's kind of like with the coronavirus now. My wife and I are thinking of going on a trip. And we thought, well, should we go? But she said, well, lock yourself in the closet. You're not going to get it. But what kind of a life are you going to live?
Right.
So that's the issue with dealing with that.
Right. Well, and I also think there is abundant data from many researchers, but one of the best ones is a woman called Becca Levy, who's a psychologist at Yale, who has really looked at how our feelings about old age influence our health. And what she has shown is that people who look at old age positively live longer and healthier than those who are negative about old age. So the people with a positive attitude about aging and old people are less likely to have Alzheimer's markers in their cerebrospinal fluid, are more likely to recover after a hospital stay, are less likely to die of heart disease. I mean, these are really good things, and it sort of makes sense, because if you have a negative attitude about it, then you're devaluing yourself, and that's always bad and stressful. And you may not make an effort. We actually have abundant research data in medicine that things like exercise make a difference. Actually, we only have data going up to age 99, but I'm going to go out on a scientific limb and say that if you can build muscle and improve your life at 99, I bet you could do it at 101 or 109 as well. So I think attitude really matters, and there is a growing body of literature, articles in the last 6 months, even in the best medical journals, about positivity and optimism and health outcomes, and it's really influential. So that sort of brings us back to the language, like owning it, saying, yes, I'm old, or yes, I'm an elder, as if it's matter of fact, not as if it's something where people say, oh, you're not, or oh, you look great. It's like, no. I am. It's fine. I'm good with it. You should be too.
Well, if we go to the title of the program today, Age is Not a Medical Condition, Healthy Living After 50, I think the first, that just hits somebody, they tend to think about healthy living after 50, exercise, what do I eat, how do I take care of myself? But these other factors that influence how you think about yourself, as you point out, is extremely important, and it really influences you perhaps more fundamentally.
Well, and that's the medicalization, right? Think about the things, although not that medicine is so good on diet and exercise because it doesn't get compensated. But if you're talking about health as opposed to medicine, then diet and exercise are key. But it's also valuing other areas of thought and humanity, such as our psychological state, our sexual state, our spiritual state. All those things are critical to health.
Well, maybe it's enough on the words, and there are a lot of other things to go into here. When I first came across your book, I listened to you on Terry Gross's Fresh Air program, and just a snippet in the car, and you were talking about medications and how medications are tested out on people that are, quote, adults, and if you take that same medication, apply it to a child, you might be in deep trouble, or if you provide it to someone who's old, you might be in trouble. And so that's motivated me, I have to say, a narrow perspective as to why I wanted to get your book. But when I read it, I saw there was so much more in it. You mentioned that you might like to read a few quotes from your book, which I have right here.
Did I mention that?
Yeah.
Panic setting in. What will I read?
While you're doing that, let me mention, in handing this over to Louise to have a broader discussion about Elderhood, the book, and the significance of the noun elderhood, which we talked about. There's a quote that I found from the Harvard Medicine magazine that says, from Louise, now alongside childhood and elderhood, the vast majority of us can also expect a third act, or elderhood, that begins at 60 or 70 and lasts for decades. This third act is not a repeat of the first or second. More often, it is in life what it is in drama, the site of our story's climax, denouement, and resolution.
Yeah, that's a lot of good action going on there, right? It's the key part of the story, and it's actually many of the meaning-making years, which we learned that especially people who thrive are very focused on meaning and purpose. So this is another area that matters, and society tends to give the wrong messages. So this issue of retirement, and actually bringing this up is sometimes unpopular. I was on a French radio show last week, and they were like, there's apparently a big controversy in France because they want to change the retirement age from 62 to 64. Which still seems rather young to me. So in the United States, it was set at 65 when on average we died at 67. And now on average we die at 79. People can say, well, I'm entitled to retirement. And I guess I think of it a couple of ways. One is this new long elderhood is unprecedented for our species in human history. There's another phase of life you're probably all familiar with that was unprecedented until about 100 years ago, around the time of the child labor laws in the mid-1800s and the Industrial Revolution some years later, and that's called adolescence. And now sometimes it appears to go on for, I don't know, yeah, a very long time, right? It keeps getting bigger. So that's what this phase of elderhood is doing also. And in some ways, we're really lucky because we are the generations that get to figure out what that looks like, and that's exciting. That's an opportunity for self-reinvention, for creativity, for all sorts of things. It's also important to note that retirement as we know it now did not exist until the Industrial Revolution, when they realized that men, once they reached about 40, it was only men that they were thinking about then, just like I'm not leaving out women intentionally, this is what the historical record shows. But when men got to about 40 or 45, they were less efficient on the machines, and so they had to try and figure out how to phase them out or transition them to different functions. And so retirement came in, but it's kind of an epiphenomenon of the 20th century. So through most of history, if you were really rich, you retired, and if you were really poor and your family didn't take you in, you ended up in these poorhouses. As if being old was the same as having a mental illness. And in between, people scrape things together. But I think we can do better than that. And the more intentional we are in approaching that, the happier our elderhoods will be. Which means maybe we retire from original jobs, particularly if they were physically taxing in ways that are no longer safe or comfortable. And maybe we retire from them because we worked so hard for so many years and we no longer want to work. I mean, at my institution, 60 hours is considered the norm, and most people will do more than that. So one of the reasons I'm looking forward to my elderhood is to do less than that, and to do all these other things I keep talking about more regularly. So maybe we have this notion of encore career or a different career. It's fewer hours a week. Maybe you have more control over it. People in their 70s are the fastest growing segment of the American workforce, and one of the biggest groups of entrepreneurs. Now, part of that is in response to ageism because they can't get jobs. I've got patients who say they won't even be allowed to volunteer, like really highly educated, high-functioning, physically fit people who aren't allowed to volunteer because of the birth date attached to their name or CV. And so people are inventing things themselves, and they're actually sometimes inventing things that are going to make elderhood better because who knows better? I live near Silicon Valley, and these 22-year-olds come in and pitch these things, and they have clearly never met a person over 50.
Well, on retirement, let me just inject something that I experienced. When I finished graduate school and I went to work at Bell Laboratories was part of the AT&C system, and they tracked everything forever, for decades. And I learned that their tracking said that the typical retiree at around age 65 lived 2 years beyond retirement. And I saw that actually take place to my next door neighbor who also worked at Bell Laboratories. Mm-hmm. And so if retirement, as I understand it, at least in terms of the Social Security, goes back to the 30s when Roosevelt came in. And people worked very hard. My father, who would be well over 100 now, talked about scraping bathtubs when he came to this country when he was about 10 or 11 years old, and went on to do other things, but worked very, very hard. And so the idea of retirement where you didn't have to work physically as hard, and of course all that has changed in our information age and so forth and so on.
Well, the computers enable all sorts of things that weren't possible before, and they're also working on I think more and more things so that the rest of us can see it. You know, again, I think that the prototype makers were in their 20s with perfect vision. I've never had perfect vision, and there's nothing about growing older that has improved that situation. So, you know, sometimes things are so little, and I'm always making everything bigger, but that's making it easier. And there are things, you know, there are different ways the body can change. And so thinking about a work that lines up with who you are and what's comfortable for you. But for some people, they want to do more in their area of expertise, and other people want to do something completely different. Maybe you were responsible and did the sort of work that, you know, that would make enough money or get health insurance for your family, or maybe you were busy raising your family and now you want to do something completely different. That's an opportunity. Or maybe you were in manual labor, and now I travel a lot, so I'm often in shuttles and Ubers with people who have retired from one career and are doing this, and when I ask them why they're doing it, they're like, I just talk to interesting people all day long. I love that. I never got to do it before. It's that kind of attitude that helps. There was a study a couple years ago looking at men who retired at 62 and men who were matched otherwise for personal and health characteristics and did not retire. And the men who retired were more likely to die. And I think that has something to do with identity and purpose, because we know that's bad for you. So what I'm talking about now with my patients in my aging clinic is if you're going to retire, make some plans. And sometimes it might be, a lot of people need a year just to sort things out. But have some reason to get up in the morning, something that's making you feel happy and a person who counts in the world in some way. And that can be anything from you're the person who picks up the grandkids at school and you walk home from them and you teach them things and they teach you things, and that's just a joy. Or it can be starting a new company, or it can be picking up a new instrument, or something like that really makes a difference. And I fear that because, we plan for adolescence, we plan for people to go into the workforce or to go to college, but we don't necessarily help people plan for a successful retirement, right? They're the golf jokes and the places where people are just sitting around watching television. That doesn't lead to a happy, healthy, meaningful life for most people. And at the same time, we have to recognize that what makes life meaningful varies. It's as individual as we all are.
For many people, of course, they have had a hard life and a hard work life. So when it comes to retirement, it's natural that they would think of a release from all those burdens. But a growing portion of the population now is not in that situation. But I think culturally, people are attuned to that kind of an attitude, subconsciously or consciously.
Right, and well, because it's also the messages we're sending. It's sort of like the messages about the words for old, and we need to push back on that, because society also says, on the one hand, older adults are a burden, and on the other hand, we're not going to hire you because you're old. You can't have it both ways. So when people start making those comments, we need to push back and say, so how do you see this working? And we also don't say like, oh, you had a baby. What a burden. I'm so sorry. There are different phases of life, and are children a burden? Heck yes. If anybody's had them, they know. But that doesn't mean they aren't also a pleasure, and a source of meaning and some of the things that matter most to people in their lives. Burden isn't necessarily bad. And if we label the years we need help, and most of us, unless we die suddenly, and most people do not die suddenly, are going to need some help again. And if you actually get really down and dirty on life, most of us need help most days, every day of our lives. Is it more overt at some phases than others? Yes, and that's okay. That makes you human. It doesn't make you a failure.
In terms of attitude and thinking about what's coming, I think you have the statistics in your book. People tend to think, oh, I'm getting old, I'll be in an assisted living or nursing home. The actual numbers of people is very, very low. And do you recall those numbers? Because I was really struck by them.
Yeah, so assisted living is, it varies a lot by where you live, but it's definitely less than 10%. And all these things go up with age, so it depends if you're talking people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. There's also been such a blurring between nursing homes and assisted living over time that it's making it sort of confusing. And nursing homes are tiny percents of people. It's actually a great trick to do with students, because they see old as, 50 plus or whatever, So what percent are living? And they're like, 70%, 50%, and at any given time, it's just a few percent, although our lifetime risk is higher. For women, it's upwards of 20%, the last figures that I saw. Women are more likely to end up in nursing homes, partly because they're more likely to live into advanced old age. And for heterosexual couples, they're more likely to have cared for their spouse, which brings up another favorite topic of mine, which is, in what other group of people would we allow men to die so many years earlier, allow one group to die? I mean, men die years earlier than women, and we don't consider that a public health crisis? I mean, usually when we have that kind of health disparity, we address it. So another reason to really own old age and speak up for it is there is this health disparity that's not being addressed, and that's not okay.
It's a little bit off the topic, but one of the things about the aging population is that society and individuals think of it as only in terms of the burdens. And I've tried to point out about the opportunities, because there are so many people with talents and energy and health to be able to do things, that there's a real resource that has to be tapped into. And I don't think that's happening yet, although I know some people that are working on that.
Yeah, good. I mean, I think we all need to work on it. I was talking about those patients. I had a couple in a row and then a friend at a New Year's Eve party. And, and some of them are willing to work for free. These are advantaged people. So people turning that away are doing it to the detriment of all of us. And it sort of brings me back to the othering, because we do so often think of old as other when we're young, that they don't sort of realize they're creating the future of their own nightmares when they make that sort of decision. And so somehow making it clear that we are all, what my colleague Joanne Lynn aptly said, old people in training until we are actually old people, and to somehow narrow that gap. But that also takes a lot more intergenerational interactions than happen, and also ones where you acknowledge the strengths, what you just said, as well as the limitations. So you'll often hear like, oh, I got behind someone old in the grocery store and it took forever. It's like, well, coming out of the hotel on my way here today, I was walking into a young person on his phone who was, and the guy was twice my size and he would have barreled me down because he was looking at his phone. That too seems problematic. But you don't hear as much about that, and you don't hear it as a failing of his entire age group and social cohort, right?
Well, there are all these both conscious and subconscious things that are built into our view of age and people that are aging. And I know people I've been working with have all experienced the same thing, where you're working with somebody and they're very excited about your talents and so forth. And they begin to get you involved, but then there's a backing off. And we used to think that they didn't want to pay us money, but those of us who have run large organizations said, we have to admit that if we were getting somebody involved, it wasn't just the money we would pay them, but the fact that they would be deeply involved with the project. And hey, this guy's almost 80 years old. He might die next week. Well, that's a false premise.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, as I say, conscious or subconsciously, it biases what goes on and the ability to tap into those resources.
It does. And people think, children are our future, or, we want to get, I was at a talk last night and somebody said, we want to get young people excited about these topics. And I didn't interrupt, which was my inclination, but nobody interrupted at any other point, so it would have been bad news. But I really wanted to say, don't we want to get everybody excited about these topics? And there's also a truth in the workplace today, which is most young people don't stay in jobs very long. They switch and switch and switch, and that is the new norm. And people are actually having to make titles within companies because they're finding that the youngest generation, the people in their 20s, if they don't get what they see as a promotion, within 6 to 12 months, they start looking for another job. So it might be that if you give a job to an 80-year-old, you've got more staying power.
Excuse me for stepping out. Alex, is that right? Is that 30 seconds left for our 40 minutes? Okay, somehow
Time
my watch
flies.
is off. You didn't get to read your passages, but what would be
It's
a final
okay.
comment? What would you like to leave behind for people to think about as they buy your book and read it?
I would say just own old age and elderhood. Try to speak about it without othering. A whole group of aging organizations a few years ago got the Frameworks Institute to look into this, and this has changed how I use the we and us whenever I talk about old age, so that it's not them. As a young geriatrician, it was still them, and my younger colleagues are still talking about them, our patients. And also, if you are old or about to be old, I'm still in my 50s, but because I grew my hair out, not to be a hypocrite for this book, I happily dyed it for decades. Anyway, so now I'm owning it. But to my students, 56, 76, it's all the same. So I've started using old just as a matter-of-fact thing, and it's really amazing the impact you can have.
Well, I think we're at the Q&A period, and Alex has a microphone, and let's open it up for questions for Louise.
I don't have a virus, I'm just joking.
No questions? I can't believe that.
There's one. And over there.
Right in the middle. That's all right.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about your opinion on the relationship between people's attitudes towards older people and the way in which older people present themselves to the rest of the world. And my experience has been this, that I think of myself as an old person. I'm 71 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't present myself, I think, as an old, frail person. So one of the things I do is take advantage of Boston University's Evergreen program, which allows older adults to take classes together with the younger students. I've done that for about 12 classes or so.
That's great.
And I was it's a wonderful program. I was very concerned at the beginning when I first started this that the younger students would treat me as the other, the frail, senile guy, you know. That has never happened, not at all. And I think both the professors in general and the students welcome people, older people, as part of a community of lifelong learners. And so I'm wondering to what degree you can prevent this idea of othering exhibited by other people in the way you yourself behave as an older person. If you behave as an old, frail, needy person that has nothing to contribute to the world, that's how other people treat you. If you don't behave that way, people treat you with greater respect. And that's probably is that the most effective way of dealing with the othering issue?
Well, it's really interesting how to approach this. On the one hand, you should present yourself always as what you are at all phases. And, you know, it's sort of like when you say, you know, I'm a 71-year-old who goes to this program, then you shouldn't have to defend against being frail. It's sort of like being a teenager. You're not going to ask for a bottle or start crawling around on the floor. It's a different life stage, right? At the same time, when you say, like, I'm not old and frail, that is othering our future selves. So I do think one of the things that happens consistently in the sort of pro-aging or anti-ageism movement is a sort of internalized or within elderhood ageism that we all need to be careful of. Like, of course you shouldn't be seen as frail. You're not frail yet. And the goal, like, there's this notion of successful aging as you remain healthy forever. That doesn't happen. Also, death is not optional so far, right? So the goal, I think, of successful aging as you live the entire arc of a human life. And at some point, that's going to include frailty. So prepare for it. Think of what sort of agency you want to have in that thing. Think of who you want to care for it. And we need to lobby for caregiving, right? In terms of medicalization, the most important thing is the care you receive. And the life you get to live, and that's not considered something we pay for. So absolutely, like, doing Evergreen is fabulous because it helps people see old not just as frail, and we need to say that even if you are frail, doesn't mean you're not a human being of value. So I think that's a great way, and it's actually showing them the range of old age, which sometimes they don't see and which the media stereotypes don't accurately portray. And let's be careful about othering the frail, because most of us will get there. And when we get there, we want it to be a place that's nice to be at.
Welcome to Boston. First, I bring greetings from a colleague of yours when you were in medical school, Debbie Shee. She said to say hello.
Wow, thank you.
Actually, your last comment builds on what my question is regarding public policy. About 55 years ago, we had a plethora of public policy, especially at the federal level. Old Americans Act, enactment of Medicare, elder housing. Today, it's crickets. Among all the candidates running for president, if you go through their policies, and some of them have extensive plans, there's nothing that is overtly speaking to elderhood or advancing age in the society. What's your perspective on the fact that we don't have an overarching sense of public policy regarding elderhood?
I think it's suicidal as a culture and individually. I think some of the leading candidates are afraid to touch the third rail of their age, right? There was actually a great article in the Washington Post about the ways they were making everybody look sort of more lively. I guess it's not just plastic surgery, but you can spray stuff on the face to give it a sheen that transmits subconsciously your vitality. Anyway, so I guess you could try this at home. But yeah, we absolutely need policy. And that's another reason, I mean, this sort of brings us back to the language, because we have policies for childhood and adulthood. So when we have an elderhood, we will need elderhood policies. And again, people are worried about this burden. And I think every time people talk about the burden or the aging population, we need to say, this is not an individual problem. I mean, this is the issue, is that we have, we let everybody suffer. And it's universal. But each family suffers on its own. I have super smart, highly successful classmates contacting me about their parents in ways that they did not contact, former high school or college classmates about how to raise their children. And there's actually also a lot of information out there. I will say that, through most of my career, there just wasn't much information about aging in the public media. And 10 years ago, I started seeing stuff more regularly, maybe monthly, and then 5 years ago, weekly, and now I can't keep up. So, and that's part of all of us making a difference, but that has to accrue to policy, and unfortunately that happens pretty slowly. But if you're voting or if you're going to speak to any of these people or sending letters, I mean, we need to speak up. And this sort of speaks to your comment also, it's about owning unapologetically the age. I retell a story from the writer Vivian Gornick in the book, who talks about on a really wintry day in New York, there had been construction somewhere and there was a platform and she's about to cross it and she sees what she calls as an impossibly old, thin man. And so she wordlessly puts out her hand and he wordlessly takes it and he comes across and he says, "Thank you." And then she writes, "A thrill ran through me." And then she goes on for a paragraph about something else and you're thinking, why was that thrilling? Like that seemed kind of ordinary and dull. And she said it was the way he said thank you, as if what she had done wasn't a big deal. And this is one of the ways we don't other the later phases of old age, right? We make it an okay deal, but we have to normalize. And the other thing I loved about that was that when she was the young person in that thing, I think she was 74 or 75, right? So really appreciating, but also not leaving people out there and not apologizing for needs. There's a lot about, old people use up too much of the healthcare dollar. Well, I don't know, young people use a heck of a lot of the education dollar. And the other big spender is, military, defense, police, and that's about adults. And we don't give them trouble, although we probably should in that regard, but anyway. So push back against these prejudices because we have different needs at different life stages, and that's because we're changing and growing and successfully aging.
Hey, wow. This is, oh, yes, hi. So I actually came here, I'm a Northeastern nursing student, and I wanted to come here today because geriatrics is one of my areas of interest, that in psychology. And I was really struck by the continuing education. In the cohort that I'm in, there's a gentleman who is, I think he said he was 60. He used to be in nuclear physics, so sometimes he'd talk about all these science things would go whoosh right over the rest of our heads. But he told a story about his mother, who's a nurse, and she's 80 and she's still working. And then my mom has a dentist who's still a dentist and has been her dentist since she was 18, and maybe he was just out of med school. But I was adopted by older parents, so it's I've been exposed to the elderhood community. And I'm in my med-surg clinical right now, and it's really interesting to see the list of patients. And I've seen people who are 94. The oldest person in the hospital at one point was 108, and just that was really amazing to me. And I guess one of the things is, as a nursing student, I guess what would you recommend for young nurses coming into a population where I have heard a statistic that there are more people who are in elderhood or approaching elderhood than people my age. I'm 26, in living in the world today. What would you recommend for us in our treatment?
Great question. I don't know as much about your particular nursing school, but I know in medical schools they devote months to pediatrics and years to adult medicine, but just a few weeks to geriatrics. So demand that you are trained to take care of the patients you will be taking care of, because the body changes. Tom, you mentioned earlier about medications. And people say, well, the problem I'm having can't be that medication. I've been taking it forever. But over time, a few things it's worth knowing. So most medications weren't tested on old people, right? Mandates to include women and people of color came in 86. Mandates to include children in medical research came in 98. Mandate to include elders came in 2019, last year. It just had its 1-year anniversary. So demand that you know and teach yourself as much as you can. That's what I ended up doing. I was an adult doctor, and I was seeing lots of old people, and I thought, how do I not know what I'm doing? Then over time, also the body changes. Like, we know that the outside changes in us mirror the inside changes. So we need to understand the physiology and the pathophysiology and how we metabolize drugs. There are so many different ways. So really asking and then being enthusiastic. So still in medical schools, if somebody say they're interested in geriatrics, most responses like, "Oh, you'll get over it," or, "Oh, you're actually a really good student. Don't you want to do something else?" Right? So just don't take that garbage. And I will also note something interesting that you said, which was that you had older parents. And what we find among geriatricians is that most of us had an older person in our lives whom we loved. So the more we have intergenerational contact with young people, the more people will be inspired to work with older people. It really does make a difference. And although there may be more older people than there are people in your age group, what has in fact happened is that we've gone as a society from a population pyramid shape, so tons of kids, fewer adults, and hardly any elders, to one that is more of a column shape, about equal numbers in all the different areas. And that is, demographers say that will be the case going forward as far as we can see. So it's the new normal, and we need to invent what that is. And if you focus on aging, you're likely to have a long and successful career. So congratulations.
Louise, why don't you recount what we talked about before about the new head of geriatrics or geriatrician at
Okay. So Tom was mentioning one of my former colleagues. She actually was recruited to Mass General from UCSF. So Christine Ritchie is the new head of geriatrics and palliative care at MGH. And she's wonderful. And I guess she was giving a talk that you heard where she was saying that geriatrics is one of the few subspecialties. So we do a specialty in adult medicine or family medicine, and then you do a fellowship. The way some people focus on an organ, so the heart or the lungs or the kidneys, we focus on older people. And my former boss used to say this, that it's one of the only subspecialties whereby getting more training, skill, and knowledge, you can be paid less and respected less throughout your career. And so then you might ask, why do people do it? Well, when they do surveys of physician specialists for satisfaction, we always come out on top. We love what we're doing. Because if you do something because you believe in it, because it feeds you, because it's actually so much fun and interesting and the options are endless, you are a happy person, and there's nothing better you can ask for from a life, given that, like, no doctor is making a salary he or she should complain about.
One more question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm struggling with my kids who are adults and parents, and I keep hearing these really, they think it's sort of cute comments about my husband and me, and I'm getting more furious, but I don't know, I feel as if I'm crawling up this wall and I can't get to the top. What do I say to them?
Can you give us one example so that I'm sure I know what you're talking about?
I'm embarrassed to tell you one example. I have a son who has he can be very funny or he can be really obnoxious. And he likes to call my husband geezer. Oh, that's the geezer, or the milestone of turning 70. Oh my goodness, it's like you have to retire because you're getting really old. And I don't know how to counter that in a productive way, but I'm seeing it seep into my life, and I'm getting mad.
And can they tell you're getting mad? No, okay. I was thinking maybe they were eliciting a reaction, then they want to go back for more. I guess I would say a few things. One is think about, are you getting mad because it's associating, like the geezer comment has negative associations? Do we just need to grab that word and play with it? Like, yeah, I'm a geezer who, really enjoys my encore career, or I'm a geezer who's running for president, or I'm a geezer who's running a multinational corporation. So what? If Mark Zuckerberg can be a billionaire at 12, then why can't you be a billionaire as a geezer? So some of it might be owning that, and other things are saying, well, you could counter with facts. I mean, different things work on different people, but you could say, well, people used to retire at 70 because they were physically and psychologically much older than people are now. So I think you're a little out of date, son, because actually, 70. And I don't like 70 as the new 50 because it means 70 isn't good and 50 is better, whereas actually studies show 70-year-olds are happier than 50-year-olds. So another fact you can drop. So, maybe he's envious because you're in the happier phase of life and he's in the least happy. He's in the nadir. He's nervous, worried about you guys. Then you can say something like, I really appreciate your concern. And am I likely to need your help? Yes. But unless we can discuss this in a collaborative, sort of friendly way, it's going to be harder on all of us. So I don't need your help now, but absolutely I want to have a conversation. And a lot of people tell me their kids don't want to have, they're like, oh, that's depressing. No, it's not depressing. I mean, yes, maybe it's depressing. Okay, it's sometimes depressing, admittedly. But it's less depressing if you have these conversations, because by having the conversations about how and where you're going to age and who's going to help, you get control over it, and you also decrease the burden on your kids and grandkids. So it's a win-win. The parts you don't like, those are the parts we can't really control very well, except for diet and exercise. But eventually it happens to all of us. So I think maybe I'd counter with facts, or saying, like, I'm wondering if you're making, could we have a serious conversation? I'm wondering if you're making these comments because there's something else we should be discussing, and don't assume you know what it is. But I'm feeling uncomfortable, and I'm wondering if maybe you are too. Just in a friendly way, maybe not with everyone there, so that he can feel comfortable being a bit vulnerable.
Louise, we'll have to close this off. The time just flew by, and I want to thank you so much for coming here and taking time out from the TEDMed conference. You can go back and get your makeup now, and we can look for you on YouTube. And
I'll
probably
hopefully
not too
be the
many.
one who doesn't stumble through her memorized talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.